I'm
standing outside of the camera.
Yeah.
Oh, you.
Okay, let's make a start. Hi everyone, thanks very much for coming. So we really are fortunate today to have Dr. Karen Throsby with us from the University of Leeds, in the School of Sociology and Social Policy. Actually, as we learned last night, a former Bathonian as well. I know that Karen's going to talk about her research today. Just broadly, I'll say that her work looks at processes and practices associated with bodily transformation as they play out across different contexts. And so this has taken her to a focus on issues such as reproductive technologies, obesity, surgery, and extreme endurance swimming, which after our chat last night sounds very extreme indeed, given that there are shark-infested waters and such. Karen's also won funding from the ESRC from her work and has published in a range of impressive venues, Body and Society, and the Sociology of Health and Illness among them. When we were exchanging emails ahead of this talk, Karen threw out a number of ideas, about a half dozen or so, that she could present on today. It's really exciting to have her here, in part because I think when she did that, all of those ideas, I think, really spoke to the interests of different people in the PCS group. So it's a really exciting opportunity, I think, to have her here for this talk, but also just to have her with her general research expertise. So, that's all I'll say, but please do join me in welcoming Dr. Karen Throsby.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming, and thank you so much for inviting me, for the hospitality. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to start by just explaining a little bit about what marathon swimming is, for those of you who aren't familiar with it as a sport and a practice, and then I'm going to talk in much more detail about what I've called the realness problem and the role of quantification and some of those technologies in resolving it for swimming. So marathon swimming is the minority, largely amateur sport of swimming a long way, slowly, in accordance with tradition-oriented rules. So by a long way, I'm referring to swims of a sufficient scope and scale for that to be the only thing that you do that day. So swims of 10 hours or 20 plus hours, so sometimes literally all day. In a nostalgic, if arbitrary, nod to the first English Channel swims in the late 19th and early 20th century. So this is Captain Matthew Webb on the left, who was the first person to swim the English Channel. That was in 1875. And that's Gertrude Ederle on the right, who was the first woman to swim the English Channel. That was in 1926. She was the 6th person to swim the English Channel. So it was kind of a sport that was very slow to get going in terms of successful swims. So according to the rules of sort of an arbitrary nod to the conditions of these first swims, the rules limit swimmers to a regular textile costume, a latex or silicone cap, and goggles. And they disallow any purposefully supportive or propulsive contact with a boat or with another person. So you swim from shore to shore without touching anything or anyone. The English Channel is the iconic marathon swim, which is 21 miles across at its closest point. But it has come to stand for marathon swimming more generally, which includes a sort of burgeoning global roster of long swims across straits, down rivers and around islands. Now, marathon swimming has a realness problem. Swims, like all sporting activities, are happenings, not objects. And the swimmer has nothing tangible to show for the hard work of a long swim, other than perhaps some temporary marks on the body and physical discomfort. This ephemerality is especially marked in a sport like marathon swimming because almost no one witnesses it directly. In common with other ultra-endurance sports like mountaineering or fell running, for example, the long, slow journey of the marathon swimmer takes place across inaccessible and sometimes hostile spaces that generally preclude sort of incidental or leisurely spectatorship. You can't really see it by accident. Furthermore, outside of the question of access lies the inescapable reality that even if marathon swimming were easily accessible to spectators, they probably wouldn't want to watch it for more than a few brief moments. So aside from the start and finish, which have some entertainment potential, very little of note happens for hours at a stretch. And it's also worth noting that, that the body is almost sort of invisible as well. You might see an arm or the turn of a head, but there's not really that much to see of the body. So more spatially and temporally contained sports offer the adrenaline rush of a closely fought race, as well as the direct encounter by spectators with bodies in action, as muscles and sinews strain, faces show the agonies and joys of a tight finish or the discomfort of fatigue. So this opportunity for spectators to forge an affective connection with athletes is lost in marathon swimming, which lacks the drama of visible speed or physical and emotional duress. So in short, it's a terrible spectator sport. This invisibility gives distinction to marathon swimming, since the challenge of stepping outside of customary and safe locational bounds and the unpredictable unboundedness of time, you never know how long it's going to take, so during a long swim, constitute defining features of the sport. But the lack of spectacle, and therefore lack of spectatorship, brings its own challenges in terms of making a successful long swim real, both to the self and to others. So I can tell you that in 2010 I swam the English Channel, but the sea bears no mark of me having passed through it, and the act itself was witnessed by only 5 people, 3 of whom were paid by me to be there. Marathon swimming then has a realness problem, and a life event like an English Channel swim is at once of enormous personal significance to the swimmer, and yet virtually traceless. So firstly, this opens up the possibility for doubt about whether a swim happened at all, and under what conditions, according to what rules. And secondly, it leaves the swimmer without a material or tangible outcome from months or often years of hard training, or from this single very long day. The use of sporting biosensors then, which is what I'm going to talk about, offers one contingent solution to this problem of realness. Marathon swimmers, this is my little handful of toys, marathon swimmers love to count. Laps, strokes, hours and minutes, meters and miles, degrees of temperature, millilitres of energy drink. The details are documented in training diaries, public blogs, forums, social media, and official swim observer reports, drawing on a combination of quantification and tracking technologies, including accelerometer-based watches to count pool laps, GPS tracking and navigation systems, digital thermometers, metronomes, meteorological devices and websites, as well as just real-time pen and paper documentation that the swim observers on the boat will often use. There's also a growing use of panoptic video technologies, which are used in stroke correction and development. This is just an example from a process that I've been through recently. So this is me, and this is where my sort of body is literally measured and then held up to an ideal standard and found wanting, clearly. So I had quite a serious shoulder injury in 2013, and so this was part of the process of fixing that and not exposing myself to further injury. And one of the problems was a straight-armed pull, 170 degrees when it's supposed to be about 110 to 120, so this is an open water legend, just in case I wasn't feeling inadequate enough. So then I measured using these video technologies, and then 4 months later, that's the original one, and then I've got it down to 130, which is not perfect, but better. And so, so what we can see is this kind of like quite Foucauldian technologies that literally measure the body to pull it into order. Okay. This flourishing culture of quantification isn't unique to swimming, and of course anyone who runs or does triathlon or any of those things will be using these technologies. Typified by the self-styled quantified self-movement, the mobilization of wearable biosensors and digitized tracking technologies has become an increasingly mainstream practice, shifting the analytics of bodily, systemic and mental functions out of the professional domain and into the everyday. These technologies read the body and its movement to provide and share ongoing data about systems and movements mediated via algorithms embedded in software that translate streams of data into readable formats on the electronic devices that we habitually keep around us. Their goal is to render the body knowable and therefore subject to administration, appearing, as Lupton argues, to offer, quote, at least some degree of certainty that one's own perceptions cannot, and a greater degree of control over the messiness and unpredictability of the fleshy body. There's nothing new about self-quantification per se, but digitization has transformed the field through what Whitson describes as the precision, complexity, and the amount of data collected, as well as the way it's ultimately presented back to the chronicler. This points to a further dimension of the newness of these practices, that is, that the software predetermines the data that will be collected. This means that all of the individual data uploaded to a given website can be aggregated to provide a collective picture that in turn can be used to inform future marketing strategies or sold on to health researchers and policymakers. And this highlights the ways in which self-tracking data, according to Christopher Till, is digitized, quantified, accumulated and analyzed in order to generate commercially valuable data on the population, while simultaneously categorizing this user production of that data as not work and therefore not requiring payment. So these most individualistic feeling projects of self-development are inextricably linked to global businesses and communication networks, as well as macro-level policy making. But this predetermined collection also performs a pedagogic function, generating new compulsions for particular pieces of information. GPS and other self-tracking technologies then are domesticated in wearable form through the cultivation of the desire for what they can provide. These processes of self-quantification align very comfortably with broader neoliberal social trends towards individual responsibility for the evaluation and management of risk in everyday life, and the concomitant pushing into the background of structural inequalities and embodied limitations. This is an ideological framework that sits very comfortably with a highly individualized sport like marathon swimming, where the body is commonly treated as knowable and controllable when subject to the appropriate disciplinary practices. When this is combined with a relatively privileged group of amateur athletes who are data hungry, technologically engaged, and financially able to acquire these devices, it's not surprising that the field is littered with biosensors. Perhaps the most immediately self-evident purpose of all the counting is the drive to be better, to improve performance. So as the swim coach and founder of the coaching company SwimSmooth tweeted recently, what gets measured gets improved. But what I want to look at today is to move away from the role of these technologies in improving performance and instead to concentrate on their less self-evident roles in making swimming real and in producing and policing social belonging. So I'm going to briefly introduce the project that I'm drawing on, and then the main body of the paper is divided into two key sections. The first looks at the role specifically of GPS data in the ratification of swims, as well as its social role through the production of collective participation and the creation of what I've called memorial objects. And the second section then looks at some of the limitations of this sort of story of biosensor success. I'm not going to spend too long on methodology, but the project is what I've called an auto-ethnography. The research began with a very explicit focus on English channel swimming. The grant that I got was called Becoming a Channel Swimmer. And it's now evolved into a much broader study of marathon swimming as a transnational embodied practice. So from 2009 to 2013 really, and that period includes a 2.5-year period that was funded by the ESRC. I documented my own embodied experiences of training, particularly for the English Channel Swim in 2010, but also for other swims later, as well as doing what Wacom calls observant participation in training sites of variety. So this is Dover, which very rarely looks that nice, it has to be said, Dover Harbour, where there's every weekend in the summer you get 50 to 100 swimmers training there, doing sort of 6-hour training swims in the harbour. That's in Malta, where I worked as a guide on a long-distance training camp, and also swam there as well, displaying my complete incompetence with boat management there. This is an island where there's a very big training camp in Cork every summer, and a big swimming community. It's in Kinsale there. And this is in San Francisco, where I spent a month, 2 months in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and San Diego, where there's big swimming communities there as well. I did about 45 interviews and documented uncountable informal conversations, as well as collecting data from forums, published biographies, autobiographies, blogs, news reports, really anything to do with swimming. It's worth noting that it is a sport of privilege. It's expensive to do. It also demands a certain amount of physical capacity and time, flexibility to control your own time in order to train. So the cohort is very white, middle class, It's about 2/3 men and 1/3 women, sort of roughly, but women are relatively well represented considering it's an extreme sport. So of course with the money and the travel, that excludes a lot of people, so I think it's worth keeping that in mind. I can talk more about the methodology later if people are interested in that. Doing research like this has a number of problems in terms of being the subject of your own research and doing ethnography, which I can talk about more. I have just submitted a book manuscript on this project called Immersion, which hopefully will be out next year, but we'll see. There's also, if people are interested, I keep a swimming blog where I talk in a very different register about my swimming. And a lot of the academic work has been kind of piloted on here to sort of test it out with the swimming community, because some of it's quite critical, and so I've been sort of easing some of that out there. And then this is the website for the project, for the SRC project. So moving on to the paper itself, I want to look at the central, if contingent, role of GPS data and tracks in swimming. GPS tracks are now a very mundane aspect of endurance sport. I'm sure a lot of us use them, and a very wide variety of worn or carried devices can record and translate bodily metrics and movements through aquatic spaces. They're also a standard and mandated equipment for any vessel traversing national and international waters. In the everyday practice of marathon swimming, swimmers, including myself, routinely record outdoor training and indoor training swims, uploading data to dedicated platforms that give that fine-grained data on pace, as well as you can superimpose the tracks onto satellite maps. So any open water swimmer does a lot of this, swimming in circles around quite small lakes and getting distracted occasionally. And this is Crummet Water, right? I did the circumference of Crummet Water last year. This habitual collating of swim data helps to make swimming real, to make them count. Swimmers told me repeatedly how in moments of fading confidence about the state of their training leading up to a long swim, they would just scroll through these uploaded charts and maps and sort of devour the cumulative totals in order to remind themselves that they were working hard, that they had been working hard. Conversely, once caught in the nexus of tracking and logging, unrecorded swims become uncountable, as in this extract from my field notes. Jim walked stiffly out of the lake at the end of his customary 8 laps of the 750-metre loop. He raised his goggles onto his forehead and looked immediately down at the chunky GPS watch on his wrist, pushing the stop button and scanning the small screen for the summary data. He swore emphatically. The screen was blank. The device had clearly run out of power during the swim. His plan was to upload the data to the device's dedicated website, inching up his totals for the season. He was aiming for 1 million metres in the calendar year, a prelude to an English Channel swim the following year. Damn it, he moaned. Now it won't count. The website for my new GPS swimming watch, Moves Count is the name of the website, offers an additional layer of meaningfulness for the data. In addition to adding a swim to my cumulative totals, pace data, GPS tracks, etc., it offers me the opportunity to donate that data to health research, quote, to make my moves really count. But aside from these individualized uses, a GPS track is now an essential element in the community ratification of a long swim, making visible, albeit in this very mediated way, that which is otherwise unseen and serving as evidence that the swim actually occurred. But although a swim that didn't have a GPS track would be treated as very suspicious now, but it doesn't, in itself, it doesn't constitute sufficient evidence of a successful swim, since it offers no information about the conditions or style of the swim, what someone was wearing, whether they touched anything, or indeed whether they were even in the water. A boat going slowly across a stretch of water would produce the same track. So consequently, convention dictates that marathon swims, such as the English Channel, require independent observation, including a detailed report, usually handwritten, that would include entries every 30 minutes or so, detailing the time, precise location, weather conditions, water temperature, stroke rate, what the swimmer ate and drank, and any other kind of incidental events, jokes, sightings of wildlife, and so on. And this produces an embedded account that puts individual pieces of data into contextualized relation to form a fulsome narrative of a swim. And it's only in this context that GPS gains evidentiary value. with this wider evidence. So for example, you may, you may remember, I don't know if you remember this story, in 2013, in the summer of 2013, US swimmer Diana Nyad made her 5th and final attempt to swim the 103-mile Florida Straits, eventually walking up the beach at Key West over 50 hours after leaving the shores of Cuba. But following her celebrated landing in Florida, critical voices from within marathon swimming focused on the swim's GPS track and the data that goes with this track, which showed a 7 to 8 hour period during her second night at sea, when her speed of travel almost tripled. Nyad and her team subsequently explained that they had struck a fortuitous eddy during those hours that they were able to ride towards Florida. But many remain sceptical, primarily because the other forms of evidence that would usually triangulate the GPS accounts, and especially the systematic observers report, were absent. So these critical questions, I don't know if anyone came across this, they found their way into the international media, and there was quite a lot of talk, and during this talk a gulf opened up between the marathon swimming insiders and interested outsiders who align themselves very strongly with Nyad's kind of never give up brand. And so there were lots of accusations about sour grapes and so on. Now I don't know what the truth about Nyad swim is, and it's undoubtedly the case that normative data practices can produce very troubling exclusions for those who don't have access to them, as well as it can produce belonging and exclusion at the same time. But my point here is that not just any data will do, and not every form of counting counts if you want to make a swim real. So the unseen activity of marathon swimming can only be made visible through normatively determined and privileged assemblages of data and modes of communication. The technologized truths of GPS tracks are only creditable alongside the anecdotal, routinized documentation of swims by those who witness it directly and in community-endorsed ways. Successful swim ratification is one form of social belonging, a kind of privileged route to community membership. But the tracks also produce other forms of social belonging that are directly mediated by this swim data. So the first of these is the rapidly expanding possibilities to follow swims in real time via GPS feeds. This is a direct rebuttal to the problem of invisibility. The Channel Swimming and Piloting Federation, which is one of 2 governing bodies that oversees English channel swimming, has a live tracking page on its website that culls data from the AIS International Shipping System to show the location of all the boats piloting channel swimmers at any given time, in real time. The same technology, some of you may have seen this, has been domesticated in handheld devices such as spot systems, which receive signals from the GPS satellite systems and communicate them via commercial satellites and ground antennae to communication networks and devices. So these tracks then are visualized on smartphones, tablets, computers in real time, providing the opportunity to see the swim as it happens. Social media is an essential part of this kind of novel digitally mediated collective spectatorship. Platforms like Twitter are especially well suited to it because they enable you to give really short news flashes that give context and texture to this 2-dimensional icon that's inching across the tracking sea. So they won't generally give specific locational data, but will say things like nearly halfway into the second shipping lane, just had a jelly baby, that kind of just anecdotal information. Remote supporters can also then text and tweet messages to the crew who are taking care of the swimmer that are then shouted to the swimmer at feed stops, creating a communal encounter, however digitally mediated, that both mitigates against the realness problem because people have experienced it with the swimmer, but also fosters a sense of community and belonging as swimmers are willed to finish. When I asked swimmers about the GPS tracks, it was always this social and community aspect of it that people talked about, rather than the authenticating function of the data. So live tracking then is a mode of technologically mediated affective relation, with the tracks bringing together a transient collective of globally dispersed swimmers through what Weatherall calls the push of the body, the compulsion to keep checking, the concern for safety as the hours draw out, the rush of pleasure at seeing a swim finish, or the sinking disappointment and worry when a boat suddenly turns round and you know that a swim's been aborted. A further dimension to this sociality lies in the possibility that the trackers offer for what Whitson calls gamification. She calls it applying playful frames to non-play spaces, leveraging surveillance to evoke behaviour change. Now, there's nothing new about localised competitive tallies in sport, people keeping tallies in notebooks, a number of laps swum and so on. But digitization adds finer grain of detail and the possibility of global play. With the rules already determined by the devices and software through the standardization of what data is collected and how it's presented, play can occur between unseen rivals or groups of rivals. So for example, Jim, who I mentioned earlier, whose watch failed, wasn't simply hoping to accumulate 1 million meters, but was also taking part in a competition between a globally dispersed group of male swimmers, most of whom had never met, over who would meet the 1 million meter mark first. So that is 1 million meters accumulated on the website for the device which they all shared. Those are the only meters that count. Tracking then makes the intangible tangible, although always via these particular and exclusive digitized displays. The technologies then can make training more playful and less like work, simultaneously shoring up allegiances to particular devices and platforms, demonstrating responsibility through self-management, and fulfilling the promise of projects of neoliberal governance to make daily practices more fulfilling and more fun. The second way in which the tracks both address the realness problem and generate social belonging is through their translation into what I've called memorial or testimonial objects. We can think of these as what Turkle describes as evocative objects. In the introduction to her edited collection of accounts of things that matter, Turkle argues that we're accustomed to thinking about objects as useful or aesthetic, as necessities or vain indulgences. But we're less familiar when considering objects as companions to our emotional lives or as provocations to thought. So in living with these objects, she concludes, we will need to tell ourselves different stories. Marathon swimming is replete with evocative objects, what Turkle describes as things we think with. Objects take diverse forms: pebbles gathered from the final shore, clothing embroidered with swim times and locations, car number plates, tattoos, photos and videos, jewellery, and swim charts framed and displayed. And particularly the swim charts intersect very strongly with the quantification practices that I talked about around the GPS data. So these tracks can be hand-drawn post hoc onto marine charts, imposed onto digital maps and charts, or snatched as screen grabs from live feeds. And these end up being framed and displayed in homes and offices. They're often used as social media avatars or screensavers and so on. And these objects serve as evidence of intangible experience and the qualities that those experiences have come to represent. These testimonial artifacts, as emblematic of marathon swimming, function as what Palmer calls lifestyle markers, which demonstrate one's ability to cut it in a dangerous and uncertain world. These displays are far removed from the authentication and ratification functions of the tracks, evoking the affective dimensions of marathon swimming: pride, excitement, fear, and relief. Contributors to Turkle's edited collection describe how some objects become inseparable from the body. She talks about blood sugar testing, a laptop. In the case of swimming, this is most obvious in the form of swim tattoos, which is a way of permanently embodying the swim in a way that's intended to outlive the transient physiological impacts of swimming. So for example, as a female swimmer celebrated the survival of breast cancer and then swam a two-way English Channel swim. It was a very long swim, it was about 39 hours. And the track made this beautiful double helix, a symmetrical double helix, and then she had that tattooed onto her foot. And when I asked her about the tattoo, she replied, when I see it, it reminds me of my grit and determination to succeed and just how tough but rewarding the journey was. It gives me hope and continues to make me believe in my dreams and trust I still have lots to fulfill. So these objects then make not just the fact of the swim real, but also affirm the values and qualities that are seen as necessary to make that swim possible. So I'm going to move on now to think about some of the limitations of this kind of rather sort of positive and optimistic story about the role of the biosensors. There are three key dimensions to these limitations. Firstly, the body's resistance to being measured and made visible. Secondly, the tension between measurement and leisure. And thirdly, ideological constraints in relation to what counts as authentic marathon swimming in relation to technology. So these technologies seem to offer a sense of control and certainty, but the illusory or at least ambivalent nature of those outcomes has been very well documented in other fields. So in health, for example, things like screening produces more doubts than certainties. So while the data from various training devices appear to offer reassurance and a sense of control over the lengthy training process, in reality it can tell you very little about what's going to happen on the day of a long swim, since neither the body nor the environment is predictable. As Anne-Marie Moll notes in relation to blood sugar monitoring, however much you count, your body cannot be counted on. And technologies too are not infallible. They run out of batteries, they malfunction, they lose satellite signals, or are very subject to user error. Stiff cold fingers, fumble, miss the buttons, or you simply forget to start it or charge it, like Jim did. So as Moll says, technology is never quite tamed. An example of this can be found in a relatively novel technology that's just started to enter marathon swimming from other domains, such as American football, as well as from the space program, which is where it originates. It's used in the military and firefighting as well. It's an ingestible thermometer pill. It's a body monitoring system that incorporates a crystal sensor that vibrates at a frequency relative to the body's internal temperature. It generates a signal that can be detected by a data recorder that's passed close to the body's lower back. The pill passes through the digestive system over a period of 24 to 36 hours and is a considerable advance on earlier telemetric devices such as rectally inserted pills, or in the case of some of the early research on cold water swimming, rectal probes connected by wires to a boat. The primary orientation of the pill is safety, offering potentially at least a way of seeing what cannot otherwise be seen and known in situations where timely warnings of unsafe body temperature can be a matter of life and death. I should point out the gendering of all this is a whole different topic, but we've got kind of men engaged in manly activities down here, and then there's the woman is sort of standing, not doing anything that would raise her body temperature. So I mean, it's a very gendered field in terms of talk of danger and so on. But it is, we're told by the manufacturers of the core temp system, which is one of these devices for when absolute accuracy is critical. Like many biosensors, it's a developing and migrating technology, and many technical problems still remain, particularly involving the real-time transmission and reading of data in an aquatic environment, getting it to communicate through water. Furthermore, as discussed earlier, bodies can't be counted on. Marathon swimming commonly involves vomiting and intestinal distress, and this has obvious consequences for an ingestible device. But even without those dysfunctions, the body's systems and idiosyncrasies don't always cooperate. For example, one female UK swimmer used an ingestible thermometer during a challenging swim around an island off the Scottish coast. The device was part of a scientific research project, but unfortunately, nerves leading up to the swim led to a rise in adrenaline, causing the device to pass quickly through the body before the swim started. And she noted wryly afterwards, that was a very expensive pre-swim poo. But aside from technical and practical difficulties, even when the device successfully transmits usable data, in the context of swimming, it's not clear what that data means. Swim observers and safety crews conventionally base their assessments of swimmers' well-being on their observable state via indicators of demeanour, consistency of stroke rate, body position in the water, and cognitive awareness. But these signs of cold are often indistinguishable from the inevitable and generally less precipitously dangerous fatigue that occurs towards the end of a long swim. Consequently, crews may make a premature decision to pull a swim, or more fatefully decide not to, and there'll be consequences to that. Now, in theory, the ingestible thermometer pill circumvents this problem, but the work of identifying reliable indicators is confounded by these profoundly idiosyncratic bodily responses to cold. The swim organisation Solo Swims of Ontario, SSO, have started to use these thermometers, trying to generate data that will helpfully enable people to determine safe boundaries in the future. But what they found is that in some cases, swimmers will report being excessively cold and exhibit signs of hypothermia while still retaining a relatively safe core body temperature, while others were able to swim and keep a good cognitive performance right to the point of losing consciousness. So just like body mass index, for example, this individual piece of data tells us very little about individual health status. So it doesn't straightforwardly speak its own truth, but rather constitutes one part of a constellation of indicators upon which you can make those decisions. So I'm not saying they have no contribution to make, I think they do, but rather it's just that observable indicators, just as observable indicators are unreliable, so is this data without contextualization and triangulation. The second limitation is that in spite of the techno-optimism that surrounds self-quantification and the significant expectations that have been placed on the shoulders of these technologies and practices for the cultivation of self-discipline, of health and well-being, there is also considerable resistance to their use, and this has been quite well documented in other fields, particularly kind of health promotion fields. So one participant in the research described GPS watches as expensive gimmicks for people with too much money. Another laughed as I hovered on the shore of my local lake, struggling to prepare my GPS device because the bright sunlight was obscuring the screen. You could have swum a bloody lap while you've been faffing around with that thing, he said. But beyond the relative minority of what might be considered refusers of the technology, even the most loyal users and early adopters are very selective about when they use them, drawing distinctions between swimming as training and swimming as leisure or social. So my field notes are punctuated with days when I just abandoned quantification in order to enjoy a beautiful day, or to allow myself a relaxing recovery swim outside of training. So this was a note from July 2010, which was right in the run-up to my English Channel swim, and I just said, today I just swam. I don't know how far, how fast, or for how long, and it was glorious. This highlights the ways in which quantification doesn't simply expose or reveal facts about the body and its movement, but also fundamentally changes the nature of the activity and about what counts as a swim and what kind of swimming it is. So this leads me to the third limitation that's very important in this particular community, which is the palpable caution within marathon swimming about the perceived threat that technology poses to the defining ethos of the sport. That is, of an unmediated encounter with natural aquatic spaces free from the softening trappings of modernity. Now, that's its representation. I think you could obviously critique that. This was the president of the Santa Barbara Channel Swimming Association in the US. He wrote a newsletter editorial, and he said that marathon swimming is about man, woman against the elements and whatever God has given you on the day. We must always keep in mind that the essence of marathon swimming is swimmer versus Mother Nature. And we'll just leave the gendering aside for a while. The archetypal, apologies to any triathletes in the room for what is to come, the archetypal abject technology in these narratives of purity is the wetsuit, or what are very commonly referred to as wimp suits, condoms, gimp suits. And obviously there's a whole gendering and kind of derogative sexuality being used here in these assignments. The triathlete is the demonized personification of the evil of the wetsuit, which is seen as providing assistance in buoyancy and insulation in ways that undermine the perceived purity of this encounter between swimmer and nature. Beyond wetsuits, there's also a burgeoning field of new technologies that are seen as threatening swimming purity by offering real-time navigational or other inputs, particularly through head-up displays, feeding data via devices attached to the bottom of the goggle lens, for example, vibrating speed and distance feedback from watches, or audio feeds direct from coaches and things, which are all considered to be sort of out of bounds. So for example, a crowdsourcing campaign's recently been launched for a new device aimed primarily at triathletes called the Iolite. The promotional materials describe a head-up display that would give directional support to the swimmer. It's got a series of LEDs along the bottom of the goggles, and you keep it in the middle and it sort of goes red the further if you deviate from a straight line. A promotional campaign for this was posted onto the Marathon Swimming Forum by an established member under the outraged title, "What's Next? Self-Propelling Suits." And this was followed by, "How about butt plug propellers? I hear they're coming to market." And again, we can see that kind of homophobic slurs that come into this almost immediately. The insults flowed towards triathletes for what's perceived to be their dependence on technological props over the hard work of learning to swim straight and sight effectively without technological assistance. This is reflected in the steady stream of homophobic and sexist commentary directed towards triathletes more generally that I witnessed throughout the research. Triathletes and marathon swimmers often share training spaces in sort of local lakes and so on. And in those spaces you will hear triathletes being described by marathon swimmers as being a bit gay, puffs, homos, queers, and of girls, as girls. Obviously, this is a very gendered narrative and homophobic narrative that we see in a lot of other sports where weakness is reflected through homosexuality and femininity. It's talk that occurs primarily among men, and this is partly because women are positioned very differently in these performances of belonging because their own status as athletes is already compromised by femininity, so they can't participate in this sort of circle of insults. The collective response to the I Like campaign reflects the widely held conviction within marathon swimming that without constant vigilance against even the smallest incremental technologised deviation from traditional rules, the sport itself is in peril. The collective affective upwellings of disgust in response to technologies such as the I Like point to a strong demand from within swimming for what one commentator described as future-proofing, taking a relentlessly hard line in the face of the perceived threat of incremental value erosion that these technologies and their outputs are seen to represent. These collective bursts of condemnatory outrage also serve a pedagogic function, tutoring novices in the normative boundaries of the sport. Not all biosensors then make swimming count, but rather, in some cases, it's their overt repudiation that enables individuals to locate themselves within the authentic swimming community. This paradoxical embrace and repudiation of technology that's evident in relation to these devices reflects a tension between the positive associations of normative masculinity with technological aptitude and comfort, and the suspicion within marathon swimming, which is a site defined by masculine norms, about the potentially polluting effects of those technologies. And this tension is resolved through discourses of control and autonomy. The authentic and normatively masculine marathon swimmer is able to make judicious and appropriate use of technologies without succumbing to seductive consumerist compulsions that render swimmers indiscriminately reliant on those technologies. This underpins much of the derogation of the triathlete in the sport, whose high-tech, equipment-heavy practice is commonly caricatured as a form of feminized hyperconsumption. As one male marathon swimmer observed in relation to triathletes, they're too easily distracted by shiny things. Significantly, while I encountered resistance to these devices in relation to practicality, authenticity, and their potential to distract or de-skill, there was very little concern about the ways in which the data itself is used by corporations onto servers that the data is uploaded. It just didn't come up as a topic. And the voluntary nature of the engagement with those technologies is central to this disregard for their own unpaid labour and the extraction of commercial value by corporations. Instead, in exchange for their participation, users receive the objectification of their activities through maps, graphs, and other visualizations, as well as through virtual medals and cups and rewards for hitting milestones, a sense of control over their bodies and over training, the satisfactions of social belonging, and the playful pleasures of gamification. So in short, the commercial appropriation of the data isn't achieved through coercive or domineering acquisition or sinister surveillance mechanisms, but through the development of devices and software that make collecting and sharing the data make sense for this wider project of entrepreneurial selfhood in which a given group of users, such as marathon swimmers, are collectively engaged. So to conclude, I'll go back to my toys. In this paper, what I've tried to argue is that there's been a very extensive and enthusiastic uptake of biosensor technologies within marathon swimming. Their capacity to track and record movement through aquatic spaces facilitates training, gives tangibility to intangible practice, and gives new forms of sociality to a highly individualized sport. But this enthusiastic engagement is also marked by a caution about the truths that the data can offer, the disruptive potential of constant monitoring, and the fear that increased technological intervention will corrode the purity of a sport for which non-assistance, however arbitrarily defined, is a core principle. These technologies then are mobilized both to shore up distinction, both within and outside of marathon swimming, and to produce social belonging. A strategic appropriation that highlights the ways in which marathon swimming, while tradition-oriented, has taken on a very strongly contemporary inflection. Endurance sport is an obvious site for the appropriation of biosensor and tracking technologies, and I personally have a very strong allegiance and frankly rather covetous love for both the gadgets and the data that they produce. And I have pictures and charts around the house, around my person, on my computer and so on, as part of that, which I love to look at. But what I've tried to suggest today is that for all of the belonging and collectivity that these technologies produce, and all the technological optimism that underlies this current rush of self-tracking and biosensor technologies both within and outside of sport, relations with those technologies actually remain quite ambivalent. Even among a cohort like this, who have a prodigious appetite for data, they have the resources to acquire the devices and a practical, if not ideological, comfort with the technology itself. And furthermore, I think that these technologies are imbricated not only in the generation of positive and pleasurable collective experiences of celebration, of excitement, of shared experience, but they're also inextricable from the disgust, shame, and exclusions that also constitute those same spaces and practices and those claims to distinction. So these technologies and their data then don't simply need to be contextualized, but also need to be seen as part of that context, inextricable from the normative values and privileged positions that determines what makes counting count. Thank you.